This is kind of where I want to ask the question, and I asked somebody that rode with me to the church building this afternoon if they were this, but I'm not going to ask you that. We're just going to start by saying that contentment has been called a jewel. And if you're filling out the handout this evening, that's not going to be on the screen, and so if you want the answer to that, that's my choice at least. I guess you can put whatever you like. That contentment is like a, and you could put in whatever, but I'm going with jewel. It's a jewel. A man published actually more than one book on contentment back in the 1600s, and that was one phrase that he used and kind of became a catchphrase for a while among certain individuals, that contentment is the rare jewel. He called it the rare jewel of Christian contentment. Now, why would he say that? Why would we say this evening that it's a jewel? Well, you could first say it's pretty valuable. If you've experienced any kind of contentment in your heart, in your life, you know that it's important. It changes your whole makeup, your whole attitude about things and about where you are in life, about life. Contentment is of great value. It's like a rare jewel. Or you just take that other word, rare. You think of its rarity. How many people are truly content in their lives, or are contented, as it were? It's a rare, valuable treasure. And then, just like some jewels at least, and we're going to say maybe like a diamond, contentment by its very nature, by its very definition, has the power to withstand pressure. It has the durability. We could make it pithy tonight and say it's rarity, right? And then it's durability. But it is a kind of a durability to withstand the pressures of life. Part of what we mean by even just saying contentment is having a certain kind of calmness, a certain peace of mind that is independent of circumstances. In fact, that's about the best definition of the word that the Apostle Paul uses in Philippians chapter 4, and that is our focus this evening. If you haven't made your way there, you might open up your New Testaments to Philippians chapter 4. We're focusing in on 10 through 13, but before we get to that, we have to read what actually is the post context, or what follows in Philippians chapter 4, 14 through 19. But let's look at Philippians 4 this evening. But as I was saying, that's one of the best definitions, is that it is having the ability to live life independent of your circumstances. Let's read together from Philippians chapter 4. This paragraph here in verses 14 through 19 is the practical setting for the letter. Sometimes it is said that this is the reason Paul wrote the letter. I'm not sure that's totally accurate, but it presents to us this practical basis. Paul is in prison for preaching the gospel. The Philippians, those early Christians, they were among those that had supported Paul, even financially, from the beginning. Right after he leaves them, after he's been there and preached the gospel, right after he leaves, they're sending support. And now they have sent him support even more again. And so you might have to read verse 10, and then we're going to drop to verse 14. For Philippians 4, verse 10 says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. The language here is like that of a seed in the ground, or even a plant that has come up out of the ground, but it hasn't blossomed yet. It hasn't bloomed. The idea there of your concern for me revived is like a flower. Your concern bloomed toward me. And so verse 14 says, yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except only you, or you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Notice verse 17, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. Now, how could Paul say that? That my real excitement is not about the gift, not about the money. And if they're sending someone to the Apostle Paul, this was a pretty large amount of money. Now, he doesn't give figures, of course, but this is substantial financial support. And yet somehow Paul says, that's not really what it's about. It's about your credit. I think you can read that as it's about the spiritual credit that you get by your generosity. That's what really excites me. And then verse 18, he says, I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. And my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. They send Paul this gift, and now he responds with this letter. And in the middle part here, he shares with us the jewel, the secret of contentment. The reason Paul can say, I'm not really rejoicing over the gift itself, but over your generosity that sent the gift. The reason Paul can say, God's going to make sure that you're taken care of. Now notice he doesn't say God will supply all of your greeds, but your needs. Let's back up now to verses 11 through 13 and consider the secret, the jewel of contentment. That this is about being content in every circumstance. That it is about being careful with both poverty and prosperity, or having much and having little. And then ultimately it is about a confidence in Jesus. Let's look at verse 11 now. Philippians 4, verse 11. How many of you like school or liked school? Okay, some of you had to think about it, right? And some of you may be thinking of which time, and some of you, like Rod, I think he lost count of how many schools he went to growing up, and each one have their own unique set of experiences, and it sometimes is highly dependent on maybe the teacher or fellow students. But you seem, as you go through life, there seem to be some people that really like school. Some people sign up for years upon years of it and are excited to just keep on as long as they can. Other people, they can't wait to graduate, and it's like, no, I'm done. I've got all the schooling, all the educating I can ever need or want, and they move on. The apostle writes here in Philippians 4 about going to school. But it is not an academic setting. It is not about formal education. If we had a comparison, it would be more comparable to the school of hard knocks than sitting in a classroom. Because he writes that contentment is something that doesn't come naturally as you just live life, that contentment is not something that happens overnight. It is not some magical thing that you pray for it and then God just gives it to you. That contentment is something that you have to learn. You have to go through the process of learning to be content regardless of your circumstances. And the word that Paul uses here, we're about to read it in Philippians 4:11. The word there for I have learned, it is this idea of putting something to the test, of going through things, of even kind of experimenting. It's a word that they would use for experimentation. I have experimented with life, with the ups and downs of life. I have learned to interpret and think through the different things that have happened to my life, even the disappointments, so that I've learned to separate my heart from my circumstances. Let's read it together. Philippians 4, verse 11. Now this is after he said, I rejoiced that you revive your concern for me. He then says this, not that I am speaking of being in need. Or yours might say something like, not that I'm speaking out of want. And then he says, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. It doesn't matter. And we read that on paper here in this comfortable setting of ours, and we go, okay, Paul had to figure it out. But From where did we say the Apostle Paul writes this letter? Prison. Yeah. And so he's writing a letter in prison. And yes, they've sent him financial support to help take care of his physical needs. And then he says, I'm not really talking about being in need, though. I wasn't really in trouble without even the gift because I've learned how to be content regardless of my circumstances. And I called this on the handout, I called it a frame of the heart. When you take your heart through life and you keep depending on Jesus and you recognize that the things of this life are not what give peace and contentment. And there's different kinds of discontent, isn't there? We think mostly this evening about finances and material things and possessions and bank accounts and things like food and clothing and closets that are full of clothes. But people have different types of discontentment. Maybe it's a kind of ambitious, professional discontentment where they're just never satisfied. It's always about that next promotion or that salary increase. Some people are discontent sexually. Some people are discontent when it comes to their hobbies and they're chasing and trying to find what's going to satisfy their heart. But here, something on the inside of Paul's heart is whole. Now you could easily back up and read about his rejoicing in the Lord in verse 4, his prayers about everything. He's writing to them, but it easily fits Paul's own example in verses 5 and 6 and 7, the peace that surpasses understanding because you know the God of peace, verse 9. And you could add that here, that contentment fights against things like anxiety and worry. But where would you be without God? Reverse it that way. Where would your heart be? Where would your life be? And then realize this evening, if you're a child of God, if you've been immersed into Jesus, you have Him. What should that say about your contentment? Content in every circumstance of life, even imprisoned and depending on people to send you so you can have the base necessities of life. Now let's look at a couple of comparison passages this evening. The first one is in 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 and 8. Notice the way the Apostle Paul also writes here to young Timothy about contentment. In the context, he's writing about false teachers who do what they do and teach what they teach because of the financial gain. And maybe even they bend the message to the ears of the hearers so that they think this will work for their financial benefit. But in distinction from that, he writes in verse 6, 1 Timothy 6:6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. And then he says this in verse 8, but with food and clothing, with these we will be content. And then he goes on to write about those who make their goal to get rich. Now mark it down this evening, contentment is not absent of any kind of growth. The answer here, the secret to contentment is not that you embrace minimalism and you just don't have a lot of stuff at all. I mean, the opposite of that can be dangerous too, right? Where your whole life is about accumulating stuff. But that's not the secret. It's godliness with contentment that says, as long as I have these base necessities, then I should be content. And yet Paul says, I've learned it by going without, by facing difficulty. And then compare this one in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6. You get this two-parter. One, contentment instead of covetousness or instead of greed. Instead of always wanting more, give me more. Being okay with what you have. And then being content by the promise, by the knowledge of His abiding presence. Hebrews 13, verse 5 says, keep your life free from love of money, and be content with what you have. For He has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? And as you read that last question and tie it back in here to the love of money and contentment, part of how you think through this is, what is the worst that somebody can do to me? Maybe they can steal everything I have. Maybe the bank can take everything. What can they do? And it's all ultimately based in the material things. But they cannot take away the presence and the promises and the love of my God. Now, we're overlapping some with that last thought from verse 13, and that's part of this. That I look to Him and His presence to be content in every circumstance. But nothing kills contentment more than competition and comparison. Have you noticed the way that everything about the definitions of things like rich and poor is based in comparison? Now, I thought of doing this and saying, imagine you were Elon Musk, but then I thought that doesn't work as easily as just imagine that you made in your life, you received financially just enough to get by. Not any extra to save or buy luxuries, just enough income, regardless of the source, to pay for the base necessities of life. But then imagine that nobody else in the world makes any more than that. Okay, now I'm not trying to teach some kind of communism this evening. We need to level everybody out, okay? This is just a thought question, an experiment. What if that were the case, regardless of why or how? What would you consider yourself? Would you consider yourself poor? I mean, typically today, right, if somebody's just barely making ends meet, we wouldn't consider them rich, would we? So much of how we even look at finances and contentment and having enough or having this is based in comparison. Oh, that person makes more. And maybe summertime is one of the worst times, right? Because it seems like everybody is going every weekend to the lake, or this person, they're posting these pictures online of this incredible 2-week vacation, and they've got this gigantic boat that's more like a yacht than a boat, and comparison breeds envy, and envy destroys contentment. And we also play with the future. And we hype things up. We convince ourselves. And maybe it is an activity that when I do this, it's going to be so great. Or when I buy this vehicle, and then you drive the vehicle, and maybe it doesn't feel so great. I was reading recently in the Screwtape letters where the senior devil writes to young Wormwood, and he warns him in the 15th chapter about the future. How the humanity, in this case, the one human he's working with and trying to tempt as a devil in this account from C.S. Lewis, he says you need to work with him about the future. Don't let him think about the present too much. Don't let him think about eternity. He calls it capital H, future, as time left in this life. Time to build your finances. Time to enjoy the pleasures of this world. Let him obsess about those things. He says this, nearly all vices are rooted in the, quote, future. Gratitude looks to the past. Love to the present. Fear, lust, and ambition, they all look ahead. That seems to fit into that. Competitiveness and comparison, the rat race, keeping up with the Joneses, and they keep us from being content in whatever circumstances we are in. Now here's the second thought of the evening, mainly drawing from verse 12. And that is that we need to be careful about both sides of the contentment spectrum. I'm not trying to pick on the kids. I mean, it's Father's Day. I guess you could go either way with that, right? And say I should be easy or I have, this prerogative. But have you ever noticed that with some children, and this is something you have to help them to grow past, but maybe just in general, there's a time in a child's life when if you don't give them what they want, well, then they're going to whine and complain. They may even throw a fit. They may even do the Opie thing and get down on the floor. And you ask, like Andy did on Andy Griffith, what are you doing? Right? And when you're done, go clean out the garage. But if you don't give them what they want, they complain. But then if you give them what they want, well, then they become unruly. It's as if neither of those bring contentment. Look at Philippians 4, now verse 12. The Apostle Paul writes this about contentment. After he says in verse 11, I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I'm in, he then says this, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. But notice the way he writes about both. It's that both have their difficulties. Both have their need to learn contentment in them. He says, I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances. And then he gives you the two sides of the coin and says, I know how to do this and I know how to do that. It goes on in verse 12 to say, in any and every circumstance, here are the two basic types of circumstances, I have learned the secret. And this one here is, I've been initiated. I've been brought into a secret. So I've learned, I've put it to the test, I've experimented to be content. I've learned, I've been initiated into the secret of contentment, of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. The reality is that both of these can be dangerous. They both come with their share of temptations. They both come with their difficulties. And sometimes I think we may look at only one side, right? And it's, well, if I have too much, maybe I'm greedy. But if I don't have enough, then I want what I don't have, and then I'm covetous and envious of other people. They both have their problems of contentment, or discontentment, should we say. And I wonder if we don't struggle more with the other side, with the prosperous side. Now, here's a fun experiment you can do. There are some websites. I think one is called givewhatweneed.com, but there's some websites you can calculate. You put in where you live and then your income, and one even has where you put in how many children in your house, all of that. And then it gives you a scale of just how rich you are compared to the world. And so you can make comparisons to other places in the world. You could go back in time. You could think about the date of when air conditioning was invented. You ever thought about that, how air-conditioned we are? Every building, every vehicle. And if the AC goes out in your house or in your vehicle, it is like the end of the world. Sometimes having a lot can be more dangerous than not having as much. There's an example in Proverbs chapter 30 where the wise king in Proverbs 38 and 9, he asked of God, don't give me too much, but don't give me nothing either. Now, I guess you could say he's asking to be middle class. I don't think that's quite right, but he recognizes here the dangers of having too much or hardly anything at all. And for him, it's that if I don't have anything, I might be tempted to steal. And if I have too much, I might be tempted to lose sight of priorities still. Another example for our day is buying a book. Now, if you want to buy a book today, you have to save and save and save. And then you have to actually go to a brick and mortar store and buy the book. And it's likely only going to be made out of just bound in paper. And then you're going to save and you're going to save and go back to a bookbinder. We don't even hardly have those anymore. Anyway, and have them bind it in leather so it'll last longer. Y'all have done that, right? Well, I don't know. If you're like me, and some of you don't do maybe all this, but you just pull out your phone, and with a tap or two, it may even show up at your door the next day. We have so much, and yet are we more content than they were then? Maybe the answer is not about what you have. Maybe both have their dangers. Here's a way of summarizing this one. When I don't have very much, sometimes then, yes, I'm tempted to think God has forgotten about me. Why isn't He taking care of my needs? Why isn't He giving me the riches He promised? And again, how you define riches matters, but just in general. The other one, when I have too much in life, the blessings can go to my head, and I've been tempted to forget God. Paul says, I know what it's like to have both and to learn to be content in and through it all. Now go back to Philippians 4 one more time. The jewel, the secret of contentment for the Christian is being content in every circumstance, recognizing I have to be careful with, regardless of where I am and whether I'm in a season of prosperity and success by worldly standards, or maybe I'm in a season of not having so much. I got to be careful. But contentment for the Christian is being confident in Jesus. If you want to steady a ship on the water, you can figure out all the external props that you want, but it'll never work. You have to have something on the inside. You have to have ballast to give it its proper steadiness, to survive the rough waters, to travel the seas. That's why my heart will never be content by external things, those circumstances, good or bad. True contentment is about having Jesus on the inside. For the ancient Greek philosophers, contentment was about self-sufficiency and pulling away from circumstances so much that you just didn't care anymore. One Stoic philosopher even said you should go to your house and pick something. Maybe it's a utensil, maybe it's a bowl, and break it and go, I don't care. And then you go out and you find an animal. You find your donkey, or maybe today, maybe it's your pet, and you think, if that animal died, I don't care. And he took it so far that he said, the people in your life, if they die, you should just tell yourself already, if and when they die, I don't care. That's one way that the world, even in Paul's day, tried to attempt contentment. If you can just detach yourself, and as one writer said, the Stoics took the heart of peace and made it into a desert. But that's not how Paul had learned the secret of contentment. What's the secret, Paul? Is it to just throw in the towel and give up on life where you don't care? Is it to be emotionless? Well, we know Paul has just mentioned his joy. He mentioned his worry in chapter 2 of Philippians, his concern over Epaphroditus. Paul is a man whose letters are covered in teardrops. He has heart more than maybe some of us have. That's not the secret. Read it with me. Philippians 4. He says, I've learned the secret of contentment. I can do all things through Christ, through Him who strengthens me. And this doesn't mean that I'm going to have superpowers. This doesn't mean that I'm sitting in a prison and I'm going to be set free. This means I can go through whatever happens to me in life. And maybe they throw me in prison. Maybe I file bankruptcy. Maybe I do well in life. Maybe I do well for a while and don't do so well. Maybe I leave an inheritance to my children of great wealth. Maybe I leave them debt. Who knows? But I can do everything in life. Could we even say I can face whatever comes down the road in life through the power of Jesus? That it's always been about Him and having Him in my heart and in my life. I go back to that equation, and we've shared this. It's been a few years, so I'm content with sharing it again. That everything minus Jesus equals nothing. But then Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Maybe that's why Paul says, I had to learn this. Are you there yet? Are you content? Like Paul says in Philippians 1:21, but to live is Christ. And to die, there is gain. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I do now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me, Galatians 2:20. Sometimes we realize in life that the only way to be content is not about having enough per se. And the world and Satan will keep convincing us we don't ever have enough, for that matter, to be content. That it was never about having enough all along, that Jesus has always been, quote, enough for my heart. And so Paul says, I'm thankful, I rejoice over the gift you sent, but it's not really the gift. It's not really about my needs. Why? Because I've learned, in whatever circumstance I have, to be content. I know what it's like to go through both. I know to be careful about plenty and not having very much. Because my confidence, this isn't self-sufficiency. It's Jesus' sufficiency. My confidence is I know I can endure whatever Satan or the world does throw at me. Not by my power, but by the power of the grace and the goodness and the peace of my God who strengthens me. For Paul, even as I write this letter in a prison cell, to be content. Now, Gary's going to lead us in an invitation song this evening. May this be our reminder, our challenge, to work on learning contentment this week, relying on Jesus, regardless of where we are in life. And maybe spend a few minutes this week reflecting on your life and the different seasons of life, the different financial statuses you've experienced, the different relational experiences, different parts of your life, and look back and think of what brought contentment. And maybe be reminded that all that really ever is my heart's content is in my Lord. Let's stand and sing together.